Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. On the day the Prime Minister arrived in Paris, we asked, has Narendra Modi transformed India's relationship with France? Or are there still a few problems that could cause problems for the two countries and perhaps even moments of embarrassment for the leaders? Joining me now to answer that question, but to talk more widely about the visit and the relationship, is India's former ambassador to France and now a professor of international relations at Jindal Global University, Dr. Mohan Kumar. Dr. Kumar, let me start by asking you whether, from the French point of view, an invitation to be chief guest on Bastille Day is particularly significant. It's not something that they do regularly. They've only done it occasionally. It was done in the case of President Trump, I believe, in 2017. It was done in the case of Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2009. Is it the equivalent of being chief guest on our Republic Day, or is it even more special?
Thanks for having me. I certainly think it's more special, if for no other reason than the one hinted by you, which is that while the Indian Republic Day happens year after year without fail, or at least most of the years, the French have a way of doing it now and then, sporadically. But as you rightly said, they believe in calling people with whom they have a special partnership. You're right, Donald Trump was certainly one of them. But perhaps the more interesting invitation was also for the 13 African countries which marched past in the Champs-Élysées. France has an extremely close relationship with what they call Francophone Afrique, and therefore they call them. You are right, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was called in 2009. I was DCM then, the Deputy Chief of Mission in the embassy. And now, of course, we have Prime Minister Modi going there. I wouldn't therefore draw equivalence. I certainly think the French one is a little rarer and therefore is a little bit more of an honor than the one we bestow on foreign leaders.
Now, this is obviously not just an honor for India, but personally for Narendra Modi himself. Last year, you wrote, and I'm quoting, Modi has struck a really close and trusting relationship with Macron. And then you added, they get along like a house on fire. How do you explain this personal relationship? Because prima facie, they're very different individuals and from two very different generations.
You're right. I was packing my bags to leave Paris and I was looking forward to some travel in the country when I got a call from the Prime Minister's office saying that, listen, the PM would like to come. So I talked to the Joint Secretary concerned. I said, what is going on? He says, well, sir, he thinks that this is a very young leader and he would like to get to know him better. And I realized then that Prime Minister Modi's diplomacy is one of investing in leaders. And he took an early bet saying that, okay, this is a young leader and he has come to power in France and I must know him. But you're right. How do you explain that? They're two unlikely leaders. One is young, the other is not so young. The one is a product of an elitist school in Paris, which is the École Nationale d'Administration. It's like, going to St. Stephen's and then doing your MBA from Harvard, Yale, whatever. The other person is from a local university. So two unlikely people. I think the reason they struck a friendship, in my view, is because both are consummate politicians, number one. Both are excellent communicators. Both are iconoclastic in many ways because Macron destroyed the right and left and came to power. He just said, I'm neither from the right nor from the left. And Prime Minister Modi, of course, took the BJP by storm. There are lots of other leaders there, but he said, no, this is going to be the kind of leadership I will give to BJP. So both have broken a lot of conventions. And lastly, if you allow me, both believe in what the French call franc parler. They speak frankly. Mr. Macron is not one to mince words. You will recall he pronounced the NATO as brain dead once. So both leaders believe in calling a spade, and I suspect the old adage that opposites attract holds true in this case. That's the only explanation I can think of.
Now, you began your answer by talking about that moment in 2017 when you were packing up and leaving France. You were ambassador by then, and you got a call from Jaishankar, who was foreign secretary, to say Mr. Modi wanted to come. And this is what you wrote about that. You said this was brilliant on the part of Modi because Macron was a completely unknown quantity at the time, and Modi was one of the first overseas leaders to visit him in Paris after his election. But did you have any hint 6 years ago when you saw that first meeting between these two men that this was going to be the start of a very close, firm bond that has not only brought the two men together, but it may have even transformed the relationship between the two countries? Did you have any hint of that at the time?
The honest answer to that question has to be no. I mean, I wouldn't lie to you. I thought this was a good bet by Prime Minister Modi to come to France, because by then, by the time I retired, it was becoming increasingly obvious that France is going to be the strategic partner for India. And we will talk about it in your subsequent questions that you will no doubt pose to me. So it was becoming obvious to me that France was going to be terribly important for India's relationship in Europe. It was the only member of the Security Council. It had the nuclear deterrence, etc. But I would be lying to you if I foresaw the kind of close ties that the two men will build. Because today, frankly, anybody will tell you that there were really only two leaders. One of them has died, which is Shinzo Abe in Japan. And he will continue to be the politician that was closest to Modi. There's no question about it. But the second leader is actually Emmanuel Macron. The two leaders have really managed to strike a very close friendship. I think it's a combination of speaking honestly, trying to win the trust of each other, and finally, of course, just the state of the relationship between the two countries.
I deliberately started with the personal aspects of this relationship because it is actually a bedrock of the relationship they've built. But let's then come to the substance. France, as you know, is a major supplier of arms and weaponry to India. It's widely reported that India will sign deals over the next 2 days to purchase 26 Rafale marine jets, 3 Scorpion submarines to be built by Mazagon Docks in Bombay, and very possibly a collaboration with Safran to design and develop fighter jet engines in India. Now, according to the Economic Times, the Rafale planes and the submarine deal are worth 9.5 billion euro. To what extent does that explain the invitation to be chief guest on Bastille Day? In other words, to what extent is the commercial aspect, the defense relationship, the critical aspect?
I wouldn't deny that it plays a role, but I would be loath to giving it primary importance or even the main importance, because we're looking at two countries. We have strategic partnership with 30 odd countries. And frankly, if it is going to be decided on the basis of who comes as chief guest to the Republic Day and who goes as chief guest for the Bastille Day, things would be very simple. That's not how diplomacy works, I think. I think what you have to really go back is that France and India, their conception of the strategic partnership is almost the same. Both believe in following an independent foreign policy. Both believe in practicing strategic autonomy, and both are seeking a multipolar world. You will find very few strategic partners with this kind of a similar conception. plus France. Again, I will respond to some of the questions you will pose me. You have to go back in time to really understand how much France has stood by India. And despite the 1998 nuclear test, they had just established the strategic partnership before the nuclear test. And yet nothing changed. At a time when we were literally a pariah, France invited India, the delegation. That was the first Western country we were able to go, actually. And the credit goes to Jacques Chirac, because he used to say in his inimitable French, "Il faut jamais oublier l'autre géant asiatique," which roughly translated, you understand French, Karan, I know, but I'm saying it for the benefit of the audience, if one should never forget the other Asian giant. By then, France had already established a wonderful relationship with China. It is Jacques Chirac who said, don't ignore India. Despite its poverty, despite its backwardness, despite the fact that the country doesn't match up, I'm talking 1998, despite the fact that it doesn't match China in many ways, don't. So it was Chirac who took this amazing French bet on India, which every successive leader has then built upon.
I'll come to the political aspect of this relationship in a moment's time, because I think it is very important that we actually share a concept of strategic autonomy in common with each other. But let me talk a little first about the defense deals that are about to go through. Now, whilst the Rafale planes will be bought off the shelf, so to speak, they are made in France, the Scorpion submarines will be made in India. The Dassault deal, if it goes through to make jet engines, will not only be made in India, it will be jointly developed with Indians. And there's now even talk in the Hindustan Times that Scalp missiles could be made in India, possibly not as a result of this visit, but a little few months down the road. Is it therefore the case that France is more willing to transfer technology, more willing to make in India than, say, the United States?
Without a doubt. Where is the doubt? I mean, look at the track record of France. In 1950s and 60s, Ouragan engines became Tufani, Alouette engines became Chetak, and then you go on to Scorpion submarines. I mean, most people forget in the area of space, there has been so much transfer of technology from France to India. They launched your satellites. Today, we are launching their satellites. That didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas, exchange of technology. So without a doubt, France has had a much longer record, much more consistent record, and a much more substantial record of transferring technology than any other strategic partner we have.
Then against that background, let me ask, what has happened to the proposal that France would build nuclear power reactors in Jetapur in Maharashtra? As far as I can tell, that project seems to have stalled. Does it need a political push? And is this visit a moment to do so?
You're spot on. If there is one blot, I wouldn't call it a blot, but if there is one area, in addition to trade, etc., which I'm sure we will talk about, I think this project has not gained traction right from my time. I think there have been three substantive issues which have prevented the progress in this project. One is just the cost of the project. It's just proving to be more and more and more expensive. So both countries are trying hard to find concessional terms of finance, because I don't believe India can really put hard money and buy these 6 nuclear plants. By the way, it will be the biggest nuclear park ever in the world. That's the kind of project we are looking at. The second is the technology. There have been some questions about French technology, which I think have been sorted out, and I think France has been able to convince us. The trouble, though, is that the last I heard, they were of the view that they would just build these reactors and then leave. Whereas India wants them to be involved in the subsequent operation of these plants, just to make sure there is a degree of comfort from India's perspective. It's a question of just having a buyer-seller relationship, and then you also operate and transfer. So that's the difference. Last but not least, I think there's been some local opposition. I hope it has been overcome. I'm not so sure. I haven't followed that issue. But these were really the three substantive impediments. You're absolutely right. And I would agree with you that this requires now political impetus from the two leaders.
To what extent is India's very stringent liability law a problem? It's been a sufficient obstacle in the case of Westinghouse and Americans who wanted to set up civil nuclear plants. Is it an equal concern for the French?
It's not as much of a concern for the French as it is for the United States, because in the case of France, it is the governmental organizations which are dealing with it, unlike the US, where it is Westinghouse and so on. So I would like to believe it's much less of a problem. I haven't heard this being mentioned as a significant impediment. Also, I think there have been some innovative proposals like creating a fund which can then, be used if should there be any problems. So I would like to believe this issue is not the main stumbling block.
You mentioned trade a moment ago. The actual volume of trade between the two countries is actually pretty insignificant and small. I think it's, if I've got the figure right from memory, under $15 billion. Clearly, there's a need to boost it. But can that be done before India secures a sensible free trade agreement with the European Union? Because presumably France's trade deals have to be determined by the EU. It's not something Macron can determine himself. And we know that although India is seriously negotiating with the EU for a sensible free trade agreement, there are a few obstacles. Can Macron help sort those out? Or are those dependent entirely on people like Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel?
So again, I would agree with the broad thrust of your statement and your question. I used to joke when I was only half joke when I was ambassador in Paris that we trade more with Bangladesh than we trade with France. Fortunately, we now trade a little bit more with France than Bangladesh, but only a little bit more, as you rightly said. So this is an issue. As a former trade negotiator, I thought I could do something, and that didn't work out. The reasons are that trade is done in Brussels. As you rightly said, it is the European Commission that zealously guards what in French is called the competence. It's not the same word as the English word, but the competence for trade, the mandate for trade lies with the Commission. My sense is that France will have some concerns with regard to the FTA vis-a-vis India. For example, and they've been asking this for years, they would like you and me to drink more Bordeaux at a much lesser price. The duties are horrendous. So those are things that France will seek bilaterally from India. My suggestion has been that India should accommodate the French concerns, make sure France lobbies for us, but there is only so much lobbying that France can do, because the Commission, as you rightly said, has to take the decision, and they will have to keep the 27 countries on board. You referred to the main problems when we negotiate with the EU, and that's because for the first time, we are negotiating what until not so long ago, India used to consider as non-trade issues, which is labor standards and environment. It took a long time for India to understand and accept that these are also legitimate trade issues which have got to be negotiated within the framework of a free trade agreement. And that's why it's taking time. I would appeal to the French to lobby for us and to make a plea at least to other countries with whom France has a good relationship. But it is clear to me France alone or Macron will not be able to swing this deal. You mentioned the names of the EU Commission President, the others, the Trade Commissioner. I think some tough decisions need to be made at home in India, because this will be the deal that India will sign, not the ones that it is negotiating with other countries.
I won't make an issue of it, but I'll simply point out the paradox that France is hoping that a teetotal prime minister will agree to reduce the duty on wine. I hope France proves right for all our sakes. They might have had a better chance with Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but that's just an aside. Let's come to the political dimension of this relationship. It is the 25th anniversary of the two countries recognizing each other as strategic allies. And you've written, and I'm quoting you, that they share the concept of strategic autonomy. For those who aren't familiar with what that concept means, can you explain it a little further? What are the similarities between India and France in these terms?
So let me give you two recent examples. The French president made a path-breaking visit to Beijing in the company of von der Leyen, the EC Commission president. And they sounded very different. I will not get into the details, but somebody like you will understand. While von der Leyen took a tough line vis-a-vis China, the president of France, Macron, actually said we should not make other people's problems our own, hinting that if something happens in Taiwan, he thought that, listen, we should be concentrating on Ukraine rather than Taiwan. Since then, of course, Macron has made a number of clarificatory remarks. His officials have made clarifications, so on. The roots of this divergence and the roots of this statement by France can be traced back to Charles de Gaulle and his decision to leave NATO, and to the current policy of France. And this is in the DNA of every French official. We should not be satellites of the United States. Not that they are, but there is a feeling that we have to really have a muscular, independent foreign policy. As far as India is concerned, the best example of strategic autonomy, and I hope I don't surprise your viewers and you yourself, I think the visit to France following the visit he did to the United States is the ultimate expression of strategic autonomy from India, as far as I'm concerned. Need I say more? We don't want to put all defense eggs in one basket. So it's very clear that both countries are wedded to the concept of strategic autonomy.
Now, the other thing I noticed, Dr. Kumar, is that until the Ukraine war started, both Modi and Macron had extremely good relations with Putin. People have forgotten, but Macron actually flew to Moscow to try and dissuade Putin from invading Ukraine. He spent hours, literally hours, talking to him on the telephone. Can the two together today, perhaps only tentatively, explore how to bring this war to an end? Or will Putin no longer accept Macron's role because of the strong support Macron has hereafter given Ukraine, including scalp missiles?
So who can forget the long table which seated Putin at one end and Macron at one end? Anyway, so I think to answer your question, Putin is nothing if not a pragmatist. He is not going to hold the grudge of anybody, and Macron is as pragmatic as anybody else. So my response to your question is, I don't think Putin will have a problem with any interlocutor, whether it is Macron or whether it is Modi, provided it suits his strategic interests. That is the bottom line for Putin. He's not bothered about what I did to others, what others did to me. That would be a wrong understanding of this man. He really is a leader who believes he's the ultimate pragmatic leader, if you like. Having made that point, I have said elsewhere that the best opportunity for Prime Minister Modi to get a first-hand assessment of what is happening from Macron. The French intelligence service and French diplomats are vastly underrated. We seem to think it is the other Anglophone diplomats and intelligence people who rock it. I'm sorry, these guys are very, very good. I don't like what I am hearing in terms of Western sources, Russian sources. I don't think people are getting a clear picture of what is happening in Ukraine. So I am particularly happy that Prime Minister Modi will get a detailed first-hand assessment from the National Security Advisor and the President of what is happening in Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi is keen on a successful G20 summit. A successful G20 summit can happen only if some common ground can be found on Ukraine. So I think in that context, the conversation on Ukraine is terribly important between the two leaders.
Well, I'm particularly glad to hear you say that, because yesterday when the Foreign Secretary briefed journalists, he was non-committal over the question, will Ukraine be an issue that the two leaders discuss? And the Hindu reports in particular that Mr. Quatra possibly went so far as to suggest it might not even be on the agenda. You're saying that actually this is something Mr. Modi will want to bring up because he will want to hear from the French president how French intelligence sources assess the situation.
I still stand by my statement. There is always a segment, regional, international issues. I'm not saying the discussion on Ukraine will happen in the bilateral, under the bilateral rubric, but there is always a segment from my recollection of regional international issues. If Ukraine is not a burning international / regional issue, what is? So I would prefer to kind of stand by my statement that the Prime Minister will get a good assessment, even one-on-one, on the issue of Ukraine.
Let me now come to two issues that have been in the news quite surprisingly suddenly, literally yesterday and today, which might be a little embarrassing for the two leaders to handle. They might even, if you think so, be cause for concern as the relationship develops hereafter. First, let me raise an issue that the French news portal Mediapart revealed yesterday. Mediapart revealed that in 2015, Anil Ambani wrote and met with Emmanuel Macron, who at the time was France's economics minister, to seek his help reducing a 151 million euro tax bill. Ultimately, it was reduced to somewhere around 6 million. Secondly, Mediapart has also revealed, and this may be more important, that French magistrates have sought documents from Indian investigation agencies concerning two investigations where it's suspected Dassault may have paid money to Indian intermediaries, one of whom, who's named in the report, is Sushen Gupta. My question is simple. Could this create embarrassment when Modi and Macron sit down to talk? And perhaps more importantly, could the French investigations create strains in the relationship between the two countries?
This is the first time I heard from you, of course, yesterday when we talked. My assessment is that this will not make any impact on the current visit, and it will make even lesser impact on the substantive strategic partnership between the two countries. I would merely limit myself to saying that this was a government-to-government deal. So the two governments must cooperate. Any formal request made by the French government will be respected by the Indian government, not others. And Indian government, if it needs any information from the French government, I'm sure the French government will respond. But this will be a matter for the two governments, frankly, and I do not see this having any impact whatsoever on the visit.
So when French magistrates request from Indian investigation agencies for documents, is that deemed to be a request from the French government? Or is there a separation, as far as we are concerned, between the government and French magistrates?
My sense is it will have to be routed through the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. That's how it happens. If the French government thinks this request is important, they will have to route it through their foreign ministry and make a demand on the Ministry of External Affairs. And our government will decide how to respond to it as it deems fit.
Let me come to the second issue, which was a debate held in the European Parliament yesterday, and I believe the voting was going to happen today, Thursday, but I don't know the outcome of the voting. This is a debate on Manipur specifically, but from the news reports, it's appearing that it may become a wider debate about the democratic status of India, the treatment of minorities, the tolerance or intolerance of dissent. Clearly, these are issues of concern in Brussels, and very possibly the government's response to them is also an issue of concern. Do you think Macron might raise this with Modi?
The reason I think he will not raise it with Prime Minister Modi is twofold. One, there is a tradition between France and India that their officials and then leaders will not comment on the internal affairs of each other. The second reason it will not happen is that we have a substantive human rights dialogue with European Union. This was the first entity with which India decided we will talk human rights. At the time, it was very, very controversial. This was 10 years ago, and people were wondering, why the hell are you talking human rights with anybody? Because we are known to be a prickly, sensitive country. But we have had this dialogue now for years, in which both sides are allowed to raise issues of human rights and other sensitive items with each other. I think whatever the European Parliament decides, my sense is this will be rooted to the EU. And the EU in the next proposed dialogue, whenever that happens, I'm not following this closely, so I don't know if it happens biannually or it happens every year, but whenever that happens, that is the time for both to raise issues of mutual importance.
Now, as you know, Dr. Kumar, when Modi visited America, and that was literally just, 4 weeks ago, there was enormous concern in the US media, but also in significant sections of Congress about India's declining performance as a democracy, its treatment of minorities, its intolerance of dissent, and its attitude to human rights. How much are these concerns, A, for the French media? Because we don't follow the French media anywhere near as closely as we do the American. And B, are these also going to be concerns for French politicians, particularly socialists on the left of the spectrum?
French politicians know, because they know that we have a structured dialogue with EU, and that is the place to take this up. France will be asked whether you have any issues. They will route it to the Commission, and the Commission will take it up in the dialogue that they have with India regularly. French media is interesting. I've been going through French media, combing it with a fine tooth comb. Other than quoting Washington Post and New York Times and Reuters at best, I don't think they have come up with independent assessments of the terms that you are using in terms of democratic deficit or whatever, which is very interesting, because it's one thing to say, okay, you just translate from New York Times, Washington Post, AFP, or Reuters. The other is to really carry out an independent assessment. So if I am to interpret that, then I would answer your question by saying that the French media probably and arguably have other preoccupations than this one.
Very quickly, and I'm not making a big issue of this at all, how do you explain the fact that the French media have not paid greater attention, done a greater analysis of their own, greater reportage of their own about these issues of intolerance, of human rights, of democratic deficit? The reason I ask is that the French Republic is extremely proud of its democratic credentials. In 1789, the French gave the world the rights of man. One would imagine that with that background behind them, they would feel not just a motivation, but a commitment to write about these issues in detail. And yet, as you say, it's nowhere near as big an issue in the French media as it is in the American, as it is in the British media. How do you explain that?
So one reason is, I mean, I've written about it in Hindustan Times, and of course we had a chat about that as well. There are accusations of racism which the government of France has denied, which the Office of Human Rights, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, has made these points. They have denied. One of the problems, and I'm trying to address the question that you posed to me, one of the problems is that France prevents collection of statistics based on race, ethnicity, religion. So we don't know the scale of the problem. And I dare say even the French Republic doesn't know the extent of the problem. We all know the problem exists in smaller or bigger measure, but we just don't know the scale of the problem. The other is the French obsession with liberty, equality on the one hand, and the values of republic on the other. And one of the values of the republic is establishment of order. The order is very, very important. And mind you, you are trying to do this in a country where the French love taking to the streets at any provocation. I mean, you just need a minimum provocation and the French will take their protests to the streets, which they have done in the past as well. So I think France realizes there are lots of the articles that you will find will be down. I mean, it shows you that France is a deeply divided country, because the ones on the right will say all this is because the police have not been granted enough powers and that these people should really be taught a lesson, etc., etc. The ones on the left will say, no, you need to deal with the problem of the banlieue, as they call it, the suburb. The suburbs, yeah, you call it ghettos, I call it suburbs. But anyway, the suburbs have to be dealt with sensitivity. So one of the issues or one of the ways in which I can answer your question is, one, we don't have a grip on the extent of the problem. Second, I think the French are also divided on this issue. There is an equal amount of opposition to one another's view. The country is really split down the middle.
We've beautifully slided from my question, which was actually about why do the French media not pay more attention to the democratic deficits in our country, India, into, in fact, talking about the problem France has experienced internationally, as far as the world's concerned, on everyone's television screen, in the recent few days and weeks. Let me ask you this. These race riots or these public protests, which become violent, happen fairly periodically. Not so long ago, King Charles's state visit had to be cancelled because of the protests over the new pension policy. Now, more recently, Macron had to cancel his own state visit to Germany because of the problem around the North African migrants issue. Has this done damage to Macron's standing? Is the French president, who will welcome our prime minister on the steps of the Élysée Palace tomorrow, a weakened man?
I'll make 2 points. One, I'm particularly happy that the prime minister has chosen to go to France. I think even if it is implicit support, I think the two countries need each other. So I'm particularly happy that Prime Minister Modi is going to Paris. Secondly, the French president is elected for a period of 5 years. And during the 5 years, when it comes to foreign and defense policy, you cannot touch the French president. The prime ministers can be changed by the parliament, by the president at will. But the president is pretty much elected for a term of 5 years. I would put it to you that Mr. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is absolutely in no danger, politically speaking. However, it's a fact that he is besieged because there were the pension protests, and before that we had the yellow vests, and now you have this banlieue. So I would argue, yes, to some extent, it shows how difficult a country France is to govern, but it makes absolutely no difference to the president's mandate, his power with regard to foreign and defense policy, and hence will not make any difference to his international standing. National standing, maybe, but international standing, no. I think he remains president of France.
Very quickly, you began your answer by saying you're very glad that the Prime Minister has gone to Paris to show support at this moment to President Macron. Was there ever even a faint possibility that our Prime Minister might cancel his visit because of the problems that France has experienced in the last few days and weeks?
No question at all, and which is why I use the word implicit, because I think this is what friends are there for. And I like to believe that the Prime Minister, by going there, indicates a vote of confidence in not just President Macron, but the country. But you're right, there was absolutely no hesitation from our side.
My last question, and in a sense, I'm now comparing France with Britain for the simple reason that Britain is the country our countrymen understand and are more familiar with. France has, even though it doesn't have official statistics, is widely believed to have a much larger population of immigrants who've become citizens than Britain does. But would you accept that Britain has transformed itself far more successfully into a multicultural society than France has been able to do?
On the face of it, it's hard to dispute what you're saying. And I want to explore why, if this is true, because this is not mathematics, that 2 + 2 is 4. On the face of it, it seems to me Britain has done a better job of integration than France. I think you have to go to the roots of the model of secularism followed by Britain and the model of secularism followed by France. These are fundamentally different. Many people may not appreciate it. Britain follows what is known as open secularism, and which means you can bring out your overt representations of religion on the streets of Britain. You can wear whatever clothes you want. You can pray wherever you want, etc. France follows what is known as, the French word for secularism is laïcité. And the French follow what is known as laïcité positive or laïcité de combat. Laïcité de combat means a fight for secularism. And the French make a distinction between the private sphere and the public sphere. The French Constitution, the French Republic, forbids overt representations of religion in publicly funded institutions and in the public sphere. Now, this, in an ideal world, the French model should have ensured that religion remains within the 4 walls of your house and you don't bring it out into the open, and everybody says, I am French. first, and then, I'm of Algerian descent or Tunisian descent or whatever. But we don't live in an ideal world. All countries seem to have a problem and are struggling with it. France has struggled with it a little bit more because of I think, just the sheer history of the kind of immigration that has happened. So I would say that the root of this issue has to be traced to the kind of secularism practiced by Britain vis-a-vis the one practiced by France. It's hard for me to say one is better than the other, but you will have to ultimately evaluate what model is suitable for the country that we are talking about.
There's a hint in your answer that the problem that France faces is not disappearing quickly, and it's not going to be very easy to resolve and sort out either. They're going to have to struggle with this for a year or for several years.
No, it's clear that this problem is difficult to resolve. I think the French know that. If you read the French press and others, I mean, there is a recognition that this has to be done. But I remain, as I said in my article in the Hindustan Times, France will bounce back. It always does. And I'm intrinsically optimistic about this wonderful country, and I'm betraying the fact that I'm a Francophone and a Francophile, and the fact that this country has got so many other strengths. Look at just the social safety net that they have created, education free, health free. It's just amazing, the public infrastructure and so on. So France will find a way. As a good, friendly country, India should just leave it to France, pretty much as France leaves it to us to tackle our problems. So I think that is the basis for this wonderful strategic partnership between the two countries.
Dr. Mohan Kumar, thank you very much for speaking to me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.